The Israel War Briefing podcast, we're joined by Ed Isaacs, president of the UJS, the Union of Jewish Students. Ed's been president since June of last year, and he's got another few months left of his term. But Ed, it's been quite busy for you since October 7th, right?
It definitely has been, and thank you so much for having me on. It's great to be talking with you today. We went to our last Freshers' Fair on October the 6th at University of Essex, and we were meant to spend that weekend just kind of having a relax, having a chill, and getting everyone's kind of mind straight ahead of delivering an ambitious set of programming for the kind of term and year ahead. But sadly, as so many of us awoke to the news on October the 7th, we saw the largest wholesale massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust. And while I knew that it would be bad on campus as a result of it, and we know there's a strong correlation between conflict in the Middle East and anti-Semitism on campus, what we've seen has just been truly unprecedented.
And when did that start? Was it pretty much immediately? Because I know like in London, you saw protests, from the weekend of October 7th, pretty much straight away before there'd even been a military response. So when did you guys start picking up that there might be an issue on campuses?
It was almost kind of instantaneous in the days afterwards. I remember receiving news a few days after October the 7th that a student union officer somewhere around the country had been arrested for giving a speech in favor of celebrating the actions and glorifying the actions of Hamas, which was pretty shocking. I don't think we'd ever anticipated having to deal with that. But I think, like so many experiences people have had since October the 7th, there was that kind of kind of initial understanding that this was obviously devastating for the Jewish people globally, including all those in the diaspora and including students on campus. But I think it did not take long for people to kind of harbor the anti-Semitic views, for the posts to go out celebrating this as some form of resistance, and it really kind of has spiraled since then. And of course, as you know, ever since there's been a more of a response, particularly on Israel's side, things have just kind of escalated really like never seen before.
Mm. And were you a student during the last time there was a flare up in 2021?
Yeah, and I was in Bristol at the time.
And how does this kind of compare to that? Because I remember seeing a lot of kind of anti-Semitism bubble up during that time as well.
So I remember at the time in 2021, I remember again, like any time there's conflict in the Middle East, like as Jewish people, we were concerned, and the conflict in Israel, we were concerned, and we wanted to really ensure that I guess our families and friends over there were safe and well. I do remember getting questions from kind of course mates, from flatmates, asking like, what's going on? Surely as a Jewish person, you must understand and you must have all the knowledge. But it was nowhere near on the scale like what we've seen now, what Jewish students are seen facing with now. I don't remember facing any direct anti-Semitism back then in 2021, but post October the 7th, we'd seen JSOCs receive death threats. We've seen Jewish students being physically assaulted on campus and so much more. And I know the CST report was released just this week, and that really is an eye-opener to the experience of not only our entire community, but also for students on campus as well.
Mm. And I thought something that was quite interesting in the CST report is that it said that a lot of the new anti-Semitism that they're measuring is coming from younger people. And were you surprised by that? I'm assuming because you do a lot of work at unis, you weren't really surprised to hear that.
Not in the slightest, sadly. We know, more generally speaking, within wider society, that younger people are getting their news from sites such as TikTok and are increasingly less reliant on mainstream media. And I think that's a significant factor to take into account when explaining the prevalence of anti-Semitism on campus. And we've seen that rise by 203%.
Mm.
Uh, as outlined in the CST report. We are looking at various projects where people are beginning to wake up and recognize the issue about social media and it promoting extremism, it promoting polarization. But I think ultimately we really see our place as working with regulators, working with university leadership to ensure that, firstly, students know that anti-Semitism has no place on campus. Secondly, this is what it is if you were to find out more. Thirdly, these are the consequences. And fourth, this is how to report it. And that's really been our focus.
Yeah, and are you seeing a lot of? I mean, we've seen incidents and protests in Birmingham and in Leeds and Manchester in the last few weeks. Are you seeing this kind of at every university you work at, or is it just kind of limited to certain little kind of hotbeds, I guess?
It's sadly it's not been limited in the slightest, and it completely varies in terms of how it's manifested. And I should say, like, I think it's important to recognize, for example, there are problems both on a structural level, but also on a pervasive cultural level as well. You can address the kind of structural issues by having a phenomenal vice chancellor at a particular university, but nonetheless, you can still have Jewish students feeling victim to the pervasive cultural issue on campus, which can plague the Jewish student experience in that respect. I appreciate that the incidents in Oxford and Cambridge, Bristol, Birmingham and Nottingham and elsewhere have really picked up the headlines, particularly the JC and other papers as well. But sadly, we have had calls and working with students from universities in Aberdeen to anywhere and everywhere else across the UK and Ireland.
Yeah, and and I guess part of this is because there's a certain part of the student experience that has been for like at least 50 years that students are primarily, well, not primarily, but they're interested in protesting, right? And do you think there's a way to protest the Israeli government without being anti-Semitic for on campus?
Of course, there is. And fundamentally, I like to think that we as a Jewish community and as at UJS have been at the forefront of legitimately showing dissatisfaction with, at times, the current leadership or the leadership of the current Israeli government, while doing so legitimately and nonetheless remaining resolute in our Zionism, however that manifests, amongst much more. And I think that the wider kind of student political, wider student politics can learn a huge amount from the way that we as a community kind of conduct our advocacy, conduct our engagement on this particular topic.
Hmm. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but when I was at university, it felt like a lot of the people that were very interested in causes like this, although they were very, very vocal, they were a minority, and the majority of people at uni just want to, have a good time and study their course and kind of get on stuff without protesting in any kind of way.
Totally, absolutely spot on. And I think often we give so much oxygen and voice to these extreme minorities. We forget about what it will often is a quite literal silent majority in that respect. But nonetheless, we have to remain resolute in knowing that they are our focus here. I remember speaking recently with an SU officer, I think it was at Exeter, and they rang up to our office just to understand how some, just what messaging they can be giving to their JSOC and to the wider student community, which would be supportive. And I said, listen, I think it's quite simple. They were asking me about protests, etc. I said, this is quite simple. Jewish students can be proud, unapologetic Zionists while also deeply caring and being true to their Jewish values, and therefore deeply caring about the cause of Palestinian human rights. And the two are not mutually exclusive. And they were taken aback as like, this is some received wisdom. This is the greatest thing that they've kind of ever heard in that respect, in helping square the circle of what their current situation on campus. But I think we've got to really stick by that messaging and ensure that this silent majority in that respect feels confident in knowing that they can respect and engage with Jewish students who are unapologetic Zionists, and while doing so in the knowledge that they can deeply care for and advocate for the cause of Palestinian human rights.
Mm. And with that in mind, has it got harder to do those sort of events like, your average Friday night dinner or something that's Jewish and has absolutely nothing to do with Israel? Is it harder to do that when the whole world is caring so much about Israel?
I'd say it's been harder to do it on campus, and we've definitely seen instances of where JSOCs have come to us saying that they feel uncomfortable doing said event on campus, and can we support them in ensuring the event still happens off campus? And of course, the answer to that always is yes. But I think actually fundamentally, we've seen engagement with just Jewish student life in general increase like never seen before. I remember I was last term spent Shabbat in Edinburgh, and I just had Jewish students coming up to me saying, I've never engaged with JSOC before. I'm not religious. This has never really been a space for me, but I've just got to be in a Jewish space right now. I'm craving this kind of like sense of belonging in that respect, because fundamentally you can have fundamentally that the experience that the Jewish people and Jewish students have had in recent months is pretty unique in that respect, and Jewish students just want to feel that kind of safe sense of belonging and of comfort with other Jewish students too.
Yeah, and I think a lot of Jewish organizations have kind of seen that people want to be in a sort of safe space and, at the very least, not have to talk about Israel, right? Or not have the responsibility of, educating people that they're in conversation with. I was also wondering, have you had since October 7th any Israeli students reach out to you and need support? Because I think my experience of the UJS from when I was at uni and JSOCs is that they were mostly there for British religiously observant Jewish students. And maybe there wasn't really a need for a sort of separate Israeli SOC or whatever. But have you guys found that you've been able or you've needed to kind of support Israelis in the UK?
For sure, and it's been a key part of our response moving forwards, and totally, it's always an area that we can improve on. But we have two awesome Israeli colleagues who work in our office, Adi and Lenoy, and they have done the most phenomenal job in creating a community of Israeli Jewish students who really have kind of felt that they can come together at events that they have put on since October the 7th. I remember there was one event that they put on in our office. It was a therapy dog and sushi event. And while my Hebrew really is lacking to really have understood much of the conversation, I nonetheless there was a great vibe around the event, and there's been a few more since, and it's been lovely to have been able to support such a community at such a necessary time. And I can only begin to imagine kind of what they're going through and how they're experiencing campus life at the moment.
Yeah, because I guess for them it's if you're a British Jewish student and you don't wear a kippah and you don't stand out as obviously Jewish, it's kind of easy in a way to sort of blend in, right? Whereas if you're Israeli and someone asks you where you're from because you have an accent, you can either lie or you can't really avoid it. So I've always thought that would be a bit tough. Talking a little bit about kind of attitudes on campus generally, either in staff or in other students. Hadley Freeman wrote in the JC this week actually that Britain seems to be into adopting American politics, right? Especially, the Black Lives Matter movement and the anti-police thing in 2020. To what extent, I guess, do you think that the current campus sort of anti-Israel movement is informed by what's happening in America in places like Harvard and, these big prestigious schools where they've got very, 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 angry student bodies against Israel?
I think I'd want to reassure your listeners by saying that thankfully, what we've seen on UK campuses has been different to America. What we see in America is some pretty pretty horrendous situation where, for example, right now we are already beginning to see a number of lawsuits brought against universities and amongst much more in that respect. And thankfully, that just isn't the case in the UK. And again, while we do have a loud vocal minority, thankfully, I think I take comfort in a huge amount of groundwork that was done over many years in the run up to October the 7th. A few years ago, UJS ran a campaign to get almost every university to adopt IRA. And I'd like to think, thankfully, as a result of the success of that campaign, we now have a fundamental tool that we can hold universities to account to. And don't get me wrong, I'm not kidding myself that universities have been perfect by any means in how they implement their kind of and how they use the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. But nonetheless, it is a great tool that we as a community and we as UJS can use to hold universities to account.
And do you feel, generally speaking, you have the support of leadership at a lot of universities? I think the Bristol case with David Miller has shown us that the university were prepared to take robust action against a professor. But I mean, would they be as open to kind of stamping out that attitude among students?
So I think there are a number of challenges in that respect, and I think it would be remiss of me not to touch upon the issue of free speech on campus at this point. And fundamentally, we have seen real challenges on campus in stamping out extremist anti-Semitic speakers. And again, it would be wrong of me not to touch upon the government's kind of new Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which, while pushed through Parliament for a number of separate reasons, sadly has actually had a number of implications which have often legitimated extremist anti-Semitic speakers on campus, even when every piece of mitigating steps has been put in place. Nonetheless, we have seen these speakers on campus. And so while universities might want to take action, they often at times are telling us that they feel like legally they have no grounds to do so, which is really, really complicated. And we're working with the Department for Education and with others in the sector to address these issues. But don't get me wrong, it's a real challenge, and I think it will continue to be a challenge for at least the next few months, at the very least.
And I guess what would you say to people who would suggest that, no one should be banned from campus, and the only way of getting rid of these ideas, if you want them out of society, is to have them in the open and challenge them and debate them, and that the idea of quote unquote banning people from campuses is counterproductive because it makes these ideas seem more alluring, and therefore gain more popularity.
I think I'd start by saying that it's fundamental to recognize that speech exists within a context, and for a university for it to lend its name and to have lent its kind of approval to an individual to speak on campus who harbors such resentful hatred, to see such resentful racist hatred against another group. I see the two as the two can't exist. It can't exist together in that respect. And so speech exists in the context, and I think universities must be places where universities promotes kind of like the academic rational thinking that students are expected to bring to their seminars, to their lectures, and to much more. And take your anti-Semite, take the anti-Semitic hatred of David Miller, for example. You only have to read the first sentence of one of his kind of, I guess, diatribes to understand the conclusion. You only have to see kind of him begin to touch upon the Zionist entity to know that it ends with the Jews in that respect. There is no rationality to it. And therefore, I would really question the value of such hatred being displayed on campuses and how that could possibly benefit the education of the student body.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's it's especially in the case of Miller, I think it's very kind of out and obvious. I think where the issues might come into is where it's a few steps further removed from that, where it's much more ambiguous and potentially people are being a little bit more subtle with their kind of dog whistles about Jews. But I mean, going forward, what would you say is a reason for Jewish students on campus to be optimistic? What if you were speaking to parents who are worried or concerned about sending their child to Manchester or Leeds or Birmingham or Nottingham or anywhere these unis where historically Jews have gone in large numbers? What would you say, I guess, A, to reassure them, and B, to kind of entice students into having faith in university as a whole?
Sure. I think in answer to that question, we've actually got to begin by looking at the Jewish students themselves. And while we've touched upon so far the challenges that Jewish students have faced, I don't think we haven't mentioned yet how Jewish students have responded, because fundamentally we have seen the resilience come through like never before of Jewish students in the face of adversity. And that really gives me hope that Jewish students still see value in living meaningful Jewish lives on campus, which is phenomenal. And so much of the response that we have been supporting has been led by the Jewish students themselves, whether that's been sitting in on meetings and leading meetings where JSOC presidents have held vice chancellors to task over their lack of action over anti-Semitism, or whether that be kind of JSOC leadership taking it upon themselves to meet with their kind of partners at other faith organizations who may have responded pretty badly to the event October the 7th, to explain to them why what they've said is so hurtful and why there is still value in interfaith, for example. That really gives me faith, and I hope reassures the wider community that there is still a fundamental place for Jewish students on campus. But second for that, I'd hope that our work at UJS can also reassure the wider community too, that in our work to lead, defend, and enrich Jewish life on campus, Jewish students are still having a phenomenal time. I know we've talked about the events at the extreme in that respect, but I think the majority of Jewish students just want to be able to get on with their lives and have a good time. We had our annual convention and conference back in December, which was the largest we've ever seen. And that was just a great time for students to come together, to have a party, and to really enjoy. And so I hope that again also reassures the wider community that Jewish students are just getting on with their lives. And just finally touching upon the universities, while again we have not seen anywhere near perfect responses to the events that we've seen, we have some really fantastic colleagues in the higher education sector, including Universities UK and a number of vice chancellors too, who may not know the answers, but they're willing to listen. And I think that's the most important thing.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking time out to speak to us, Ed, and good luck with it all.
Thank you so much, Josh. Lovely to chat with you all.